Hey guys, Aaron here. Today we're going to be replacing a starter on a Nissan Titan. Now these procedures will be the same years 2004 through 2015. And as you may already know, the starter is located underneath the intake manifold, which makes the job a little bit more difficult. However, with these steps and a couple tips and tricks I'm going to give you along the way, I believe that anybody can do this with simple hand tools. Now this particular truck is a 2004 Nissan Titan with about 225,000 miles. Now what we're getting is an intermittent click where we go to turn over the vehicle and it just clicks. Sometimes it starts, sometimes it doesn't. Now before we begin, let's go over the parts and tools we're going to need to get the job done. Alright, so we're going to need a 12mm socket, a 10mm, 8mm, and a 14mm socket. Going to need a 3/8 extension about 6 inches long, needle nose pliers, 3/8 ratchet. This is just my power ratchet. It makes the job go by a little quicker. You're also going to need a fuel disconnect line. We're going to be using the top tool right here. This is going to be a 5/16 size. It's probably equal to about 8mm. You can get these at any auto parts store, O'Reilly's, Napa, they all got them. Going to use a 1/2 inch ratchet as well. This is a nice swivel ratchet. It's going to help us remove the bolts for our starter. And then of course your new starter as well. I really suggest you get an OEM brand new starter. That's the best quality you can get. However, unfortunately, I'm not able to go with that this time. I'm going to be using a new starter by O'Reilly Auto Parts. I'll put a link in the description of where you can purchase an OE starter and how much they are. And then of course we're going to be taking off our intake manifold, so we're going to need some new manifold plenum gaskets as well. Now in a conventional starter location, which is just on the side of the engine, first thing you do is disconnect the battery. But actually, since we're going to be having to remove the fuel lines and fuel system off this intake manifold, what we're going to have to do is release the fuel pressure. And the easiest way to do that is simply remove the fuel pump fuse, which is located back here. Now obviously we're lucky here because we could turn the motor and release the fuel pressure. However, if your starter is bad, you won't be able to release the fuel pressure. Just grab some rags, and when we go to disconnect the fuel line, you're pretty much just going to have to soak up any fuel that leaks out with those rags. And to get to that fuel pump fuse, go ahead and remove the large plastic cover that's back here. Depress the 2 clips and remove the cover, set it aside. And starting from the left, we're going to be counting right 7 positions. The fuel pump fuse is a 15 amp blue fuse if you have an OEM fuse still installed. And it's actually labeled on our cover right here, which makes a nice fuel pump. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. Then we're going to start the engine, and we're going to let the engine release itself of all of the fuel pressure. Now that the fuel pressure has been released from the fuel lines, we can go ahead and disconnect our battery. I like to just take a 10mm wrench and loosen up the nut on the terminal. Take it off. We don't want this vehicle accidentally starting or someone turning on the ignition. We will have multiple sensors disconnected, so we're just going to do this to avoid any problems that could occur from that. Now this engine doesn't have an engine cover, so yours probably does. Remove the 2 10mm bolts on this bracket here and simply lift up and out. After that, go ahead and remove your intake. This has an aftermarket intake, so what we're going to need is a 8mm socket or a flathead screwdriver to get the hose clamps off, and then we're going to have to disconnect our mass airflow sensor. And we're also going to have to remove the breather lines that go to each valve cover. I'm probably just going to take the hoses off at the valve cover connection. That way we could just remove this whole assembly. Next thing, to remove the PCV hoses that are attached to the intake manifold. These hose clamps are spring loaded, so I just take some pliers to remove those. Next, using a 10mm socket, we're going to remove the bolt that holds on this bracket that holds on our transmission dipstick. Just bend it out of the way. Now the next thing to do is to disconnect the 2 coolant lines that go to the throttle body. What I went ahead and did is added a connector and bypass the throttle body. So if you don't have this, just a connector to connect them back together so that you don't have a pretty large leak, just disconnect them. Some antifreeze will spill out onto the ground. Just make sure you replace that antifreeze when you go to start up your motor. Now while we're still working on the passenger side here, pretty much the last thing to do on this side is going to be to remove the connectors on the fuel injectors. There's a little clip on the bottom. Simply just depress the clip, push the clip in, and pull out. So at this point, we pretty much have everything disconnected from the passenger side of the intake manifold. Moving over to the driver's side, we have a couple more things. We have our evap purge solenoid right here and a couple other lines. Now, instead of disconnecting everything, every hose separately, what I like to do is keep this all as an assembly and remove least as possible. Starting right here at the intake manifold, let's just go ahead and remove this line. And then using a 10mm socket, we're gonna remove this bracket right here, and this whole assembly is gonna swing sideways. Now, using shown earlier in the video, we're gonna take our little disconnect tool and disconnect the fuel line. Now, the idea here is to push the fuel line in, insert the tool, and then push out. If you're having trouble, you can go ahead and take some WD-40, and that will aid our little tool right here to be inserted. Sometimes they're hard, sometimes they come right off. It's kind of hit or miss. What we're doing is we're expanding a spring inside of this bell right here, which will allow us to disconnect it. Push in, and pull out. Just bend that out of the way. And now the last thing is to go ahead and remove all the fuel injection connectors on this side of the manifold. Now, 2 quick tips before we remove our intake manifold. If there's any parts or anything up here on your cowl, go ahead and remove them. We're gonna have exposed cylinder heads, intake ports. When we remove this intake manifold, we don't want something by accident falling into our motor. And also, if you have some shop air, go ahead and just blow out the valve cover intake manifold area right here. We were wrestling with a lot of wires and a lot of dirt and stuff has fallen. So go ahead, we really want to get this area clean as possible before we remove this. And after that's all done, all we have left is to remove the 10mm bolts that hold on our intake manifold. The last thing to do is to remove the rear brake booster line, that the rear vacuum line that goes to our brake booster back here. What I like to do is just go ahead and take it off at the brake booster, fold it around, and move it all out as an assembly. The last thing to do is to make sure we don't have any obstructions or any more wires that are connected to our manifold. The last thing we want to do when taking this out is have an obstruction. We look to be pretty good. So simply just lift up and out. And there we have it. There's our starter. So as you can see, we have access to our ports right here that are open. So before we do anything else, what I like to do is just clean these off and put some tape over these ports. The last thing that we need is something falling into our motor. Now there's a total of 2 bolts that hold this starter on, and they're both up on top. So what I like to do is just take some WD-40 and spray off the threads of those bolts. And using my 1/2-inch swivel ratchet with a 14mm shortwell socket, it's going to give us the best way and the best chance of breaking these bolts loose. Now, one thing to note is that these bolts are torqued on pretty tight. So using a smaller ratchet, you're probably not going to be able to break them loose. Now that we have those broken loose, I'm going to use my power ratchet to take the bolts out all the way. before we take the starter out, we're going to need to remove the connector on the signal wire, which is located right here. There's a bracket on the back side of the left cylinder head with a grommet that you need to remove. Just go ahead, take some pliers to compress it, and that connector will pull out of the bracket. There it is. There's a little tab that we have to depress, and it should pull right out. There we are. Let's remove the cover for the battery wire. And by using our 12mm socket, we can take off this nut and take off our battery cable. Just gonna put the nut back on. Now from here, it's pretty much reverse procedure. Start with a battery cable. Let's go ahead and hook up our signal side of the intake manifold's way. Now chances are, if you have a aftermarket remanufactured starter like this one, you're gonna have to zip tie the starter wire back to their brackets. Now we can go ahead and put our two 14mm bolts back in. Now that our old starter's out and our new starter's in, the last thing to do before we put our intake manifold back on is to replace the gaskets underneath. To remove the gaskets, simply just take the tab at the top and pull. One thing to note, that when your intake manifold is upside down, your fuel will leak, so just go ahead and have a rag over the port of the inlet, and it should catch everything that comes out. And the new gaskets install the same way that the old ones come off. Just make sure they're fully seated into the intake before we install it. The last thing to do before we throw our intake on is just to clean our ports and make sure that the seating surface of the heads are nice and clean. Alright, now's a good time to go ahead and throw our bolts in. I like to start each bolt before we tighten any of them down. If we need to manipulate this manifold and it's tightened down, it's going to be very hard to do. Now that all our bolts are in, I'm just going to go ahead and get them somewhat tight. The last step is going to be to torque these bolts down to 7 foot-pounds. This intake manifold's plastic, and our O-rings don't really need a lot of torque to seal correctly. That's why the torque number on these manifolds is so low. You really don't need to get these things tight to get them to seal properly. When you're torquing it down, I like to start in the middle and work outwards. Start in the middle bolts and then kind of crisscross going out side to side. Again, 7 foot-pounds is a torque specification. It's not very tight. Alright, so now it's just a matter of putting everything back in pretty much reverse procedure, starting with the brake hose onto the brake booster. Now our fuel injector connectors. Make sure they're fully seated when you press them down. You should hear an audible click every time. Now that we have everything back together, the last step is going to be putting back the fuse for the fuel pump. And putting back our battery cable. Now the very last step is to go ahead and start it and verify that our new starter works properly. As you can see, it does. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope this video helped you out. If it has, please like and subscribe. If you guys need any help or you have any questions at all, feel free to leave something in the comment section. Thanks for watching always, guys. Take care.